welcome everyone. I'm Karen von Hippel, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here for the first Duke of Wellington Medal for Military History. I would like to just provide a little bit of background on the medal and then thank a few people before I turn the floor over to Mike Clark, who will be emceeing the event tonight. For those of you who don't know, RUSI established this book award in 1997, and it was called the Duke of Westminster Medal for Military Literature. And we were very lucky to have the support of His Grace the Sixth Duke of Westminster, who generously supported the medal as well as supported other activities at RUSI. He was a former vice president of ours for many years. And as most of you know, he was also a big supporter of the military here. He had been a reservist himself. Sadly, he passed away in August 2016, and together with his estate, we agreed that it was time to transition the medal, and we were very grateful to the Duke of Wellington, the ninth Duke of Wellington, to allow us to use his name in honor of our founder, the first Duke of Wellington, for the medal. And so we're really happy to transition it in that way. We also decided to narrow the focus to military history, and I know the Duke will talk about that a bit more when he gets up. So I really want to thank a few people before I pass over. First, of course, to Mike Clark for chairing this. We really are grateful for your support, and I think Mike will explain a bit more about the selection process for the book, and also he'll introduce the members of the committee. Thank you to Jonathan and Malcolm, who had the arduous but enjoyable task of narrowing the list of books down from a very large number to 6. It turns out there are a lot of very good books on military history coming out every year, and so we're grateful for what you did. Of course, thank you to the Duke for obviously letting us use your name, but as well as generously supporting the medal itself. And then, of course, I want to thank an anonymous donor who is sponsoring the reception that we will have a little bit later. I forgot to mention, welcome to the ambassador from Norway to the United Kingdom, Mona Jewel, who's here, and we're really grateful to have you here for this as well. And then finally, congratulations to General Sir John Kiszely for a really excellent book. We're really honored to have you here tonight. So over to you, Mike.
Karen, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be the chairman of the judging panel, having been involved in the old medal before the new sponsorship and the new backing from His Grace the Duke of Wellington. The way in which we did it, we had a very distinguished panel that was Lord Sumption and Hugh Strawn, Malcolm Chalmers and Jonathan were on it, of course, Professor Beatrice Heiser, I was on it, and of course His Grace the Duke of Wellington. And we received a short list of books. 30-odd books were looked at by Jonathan and Malcolm. That was a long list. They were narrowed down by them to a short list of 6, and then the judges were sent all 6 books, and we read them, I think, after Christmas, and we scored them. The idea was that we all gave a score from 6 to 1 or 1 to 6, and then looked at the scores, and then we met to discuss the scores and to look at how we felt about them, and were able to establish it that way. And we realised that some of us were involved in editorial processes that some of these books will have gone through and will go through, and we realised that we might need to recuse ourselves from consideration of a certain book at a certain time, and then we looked at a way of adjusting the scores in order to maintain parity where that was done, and in one case we did that this time. So we're very happy that we have a robust judging process. And I have to say that on the basis of what we did, I'm happy to report that I think that military history studies are in robust good health, because the shortlist was very good. It was very distinguished. You know, we're surrounded in our society by really lousy history. History that makes everything look as if it's a version of the present. There are programs on television that purport to be histories, and they might just as well be Hollyoaks in tights. They're awful. And the point about history, good history, is to observe what L.P. Hartley said, that the past is another country. They do things differently there. The good historian not just has to get the facts together, but also make that imaginative leap as to how people felt 60 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. What was the culture? What was the background? And really good historians are not just good at collating material, but they're good with their imaginations. And I think what we've seen here is really good military history of that both hard-edged investigatory forensic sort, but also that imaginative thought. Because history is dynamite. Of course, there are many distinguished historians in the room. We know that history is not an account of what happened in the past. It's the stories that we tell ourselves about what happened in the past. That's what history is. There was a famous case of a journalist speaking to a young Serb during the middle of the Bosnian War in the 1990s. And the Serb said to the journalist, this young man, he said, "You don't realise what suffering we've been through. The Battle of Kosovo in 1389, and then the Second Battle of Kosovo in 1448, and then the Turkish, the Ottomans, and then the Croat fascists, and then the communists. You don't realise what we've been through." And the journalist said, "Yes, but that was all a long time ago." And the lad said, "Yeah, but I only found out about it last week." History is absolute dynamite. And in these books, in the shortlisted books, were really good. It was wonderful actually having to read them and having to read them in a structured way. Peter Grindle was one of the runners-up. He wrote the book Opposing the Slavers, about the Royal Navy's campaign from 1807, when slavery was outlawed, to 1840, just 10 years before it was actually abolished. And he looks at the naval campaigns of that era, much forgotten. And you know, when society decides to abolish slavery, somebody has to get out there and do it. And the Royal Navy did it and doesn't get a lot of credit for that. And it's interesting the way he describes how in that period each of these commitments became a bit of a quagmire, and they were running out of energy by the end. They got fed up of doing it. But my goodness, it was the Navy that made the difference to the abolition of slavery. It's a really good account of how that came about. Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro, another of the runners-up, they wrote about the internationalists. They looked at the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, and they said it wasn't a useless piece of drafting. He said it actually marked a turning point in the way we thought about war. That we thought about war as illegitimate after 1928, and they look at the philosophical and the legal basis of that. And they worry, of course, in the later part of the book, that we may be going back to a pre-1928 feeling about war as somehow a normal function of policy rather than an absolute last resort. Really good piece of work. And then we had 3 books about the Second World War. Srinath Raghavan wrote a wonderful book about India in the Second World War. And I have to say, if I hadn't been on the panel, I probably wouldn't have read this book, and I'm really glad that I did. It was wonderful. It's a fascinating account which mixes in the military side of India's war with the what was happening in the Congress Party and the Muslim League and the Raj. And, I mean, as an Indian writer, he was culturally very sensitive, but he was analytically neutral. And it's the art that conceals the art. It's a very good piece of scholarship, a really good piece of what I call good, real history. And then Alexander Hill's book, The Red Army in the Second World War. That was one of the books that was part of the Armies of the Second World War series. And it is a tremendous account, right down to the tactical level, of the vicious campaigns that the Red Army engaged in between 1941 and 1945. And it's all there. Great work of scholarship, great work of reference. And although we know a lot about the Red Army, we'll never know it to this depth of analysis that he managed to achieve. And last but not least, of course, are the runners-up, Theo Farrell's book on Afghanistan. And Theo went to Afghanistan. He worked at the military a fair bit. He did a lot of research afterwards. It's the best single account of Operation Herrick from 2001 to 2014. It's the best single account of the British campaign, I think, in most of our views. And what's interesting is that Theo, as an academic, went and lived with the military for a while, worked in the prison cell in Kandahar, and he didn't get in thrall. Academics always get in thrall to the military when we get too close to them, because we love it. We love the uniforms and the glamour and the terminology. And he didn't. He understood the way the military was thinking. He understood the problems. He looked at the political military interactions, but he was unflinching in his thoughts and his criticisms. And that makes it a very good piece of work. And so, of course, I don't intend to say very much about John Kiszely's book, The Winner, The Anatomy of a Campaign, the winning book, except to say that I think John's book encapsulated all of the virtues that I've mentioned before. Tremendous scholarship, great sense of sensitivity, that leap of imagination to understand how people react in the chaotic circumstances in which they found themselves, and an unflinching analysis that he tells it the way he sees it. It really is a really considerable work of interpretive and imaginative history. And I think it sits atop a very close run thing, actually, if I can use that phrase, sir. The shortlist was extremely good. I was very, very impressed with it. And I've been on a few shortlists, not just here, but in other institutions. And this was a very, very good shortlist. And by a short head, John's book wins the prize. But he wins it for encapsulating everything else that was good about good history. And so on that basis, I'm delighted to be chair of this panel. I'll be delighted to do it again next year. I think it will go from strength to strength. And I thank His Grace Duke of Wellington for his continuing support and sponsorship now for this new, slightly tightly more focused version of the prize, military history. And I'm very happy to hand over to His Grace to actually make the presentation. Your Grace.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am really pleased that Karin, who of course we all know is very persuasive, persuaded me to allow my ancestor's name, I must emphasize it's not my name, it's my ancestor's name, attached to this prize. He particularly, I think, suitable as he was the founder of this institution. And I'm very proud of the fact that he was the founder, and therefore it seemed to me an excellent idea that his name should be attached to this prize. I have to say that I'm not sure he would have been pleased with me, because I asked our archivist to dig out a couple of quotes on his view about history and historians. I never read these modern productions called histories, in which my name must be made use of, because I do not wish to be tempted to write myself. I thought that was quite amusing. And then I am really disgusted with and ashamed of all that I have seen written of the Battle of Waterloo. The number of writings upon it would lead the world to suppose that the British Army had never fought a battle before, and there is not one that contains a true representation. So he didn't have that high an opinion, I'm sorry to say, of historians. However, that notwithstanding, I found the experience of being a member of the panel, of reading these books, as Michael Clark has said, of extraordinarily high standard. And I agree with Michael Clark. Probably I wouldn't have read many of these books if it hadn't been for this prize and serving on the panel. I found it extraordinarily difficult to decide how to vote, how to use my votes. But we, out of a very, very strong field, there is no doubt that we have an outstandingly good winner. Fascinating story, fascinating analysis of how the decisions were made to undertake this operation. For me, it's been a most enhancing and enlightening experience. I hope I'm remembering rightly, but I think the last sentence of the book goes something like this: a sorry tale, but a cautionary tale, or words to that effect. I hope I've got that quote more or less right. And it did seem to me a very, very good summary in a few words of the essence of the book. So I am really pleased to now, in a moment, present the award. I'll just quickly say something about the medal. In order to devise this medal, we chose a medal at Apsley House as the image, the mould, a medal that had been cast in January 1827, on the day that the first Duke was made Commander-in-Chief of the army in succession to the recently deceased Duke of York, under whom, of course, the Duke had ultimately served for most of his military career. And the Duke became Commander-in-Chief in January 1827. As you probably all know, he resigned later that year, and then again was invited I have the letter at Stratfield saying George the Fourth, George the Fourth, yes, of course. George the Fourth writes to him saying, I hope that the country will no longer be deprived of your talents, and I invite you to take command again of my army. Anyway, that is the medal which I now would ask the General to come forward to receive.
Your Grace, thank you very much indeed. I am deeply honoured to receive this medal, and thank you, Michael, also for your very kind remarks. All the more honoured when I think of previous winners of the medal, in the Duke of Westminster's medal, historians who I am humbled to be even thought of as being possibly in the same company as them. I'd like at the outset to pay tribute to many people who went out of their way to help me along the way in the production of this book, in particular to those at the Changing Character of War Centre at Pembroke College, Oxford, where I spent 3 years as a visiting research fellow. And I'm delighted that my supervisor, Rob Johnson, is here today. And also to those at my publishers, Cambridge University Press, and I'm delighted to see they're represented today by Lauren Simpson. I'm very much looking forward to questions from what I'm sure is the best informed audience on the subject that I shall ever address. But a few words to start with by way of background and introduction. The provenance of this book comes from my association as student, as course director, and then as a visiting lecturer with the Higher Command and Staff course at Shrivenham, and its focus on the study of campaigns. For some time, I've wanted to take a campaign, to deconstruct it, and analyse its anatomy, its constituent parts, and their relationship with each other, such as the levels of warfare, command relationships, decision-making structures, the relationship between policy, strategy, and plans, to see what that might tell us about the campaign and what, if anything, it might tell us about campaigns more generally, and to do so in plain language, bereft of military jargon, acronyms, abbreviations, in order to make it accessible to the non-military reader. I chose the British campaign in Norway in 1940 for 3 main reasons. Firstly, it was little known, outside Norway that is. Secondly, it was clearly an abject failure and therefore might have more to tell us than might a campaign that was a success. And thirdly, because it was full of drama, both militarily and politically. Now, little known it may have been, but there are over a dozen books on this subject in the English language, many of them fine, comprehensive accounts. But I've indicated my book does not set out to be a comprehensive blow-by-blow account. It sets out to analyse the British campaign as a campaign. Now, many of the accounts take as their beginning the moment the first shot was fired, skating lightly over the planning process, and then focus very much on the tactical level, on the level of battles and engagements, because a lot of readers want to read about that sort of thing. But as this audience knows, to understand a campaign properly, one has to understand its context and go back to its genesis. And fully 1/3 of my book covers the period before the first shot was fired. The focus throughout is mainly, though far from exclusively, at the strategic level and at the process of strategy. the balancing of ends, ways and means, and the development of the ways and means to meet the ends defined by policy. It became apparent to me early on in my research that many, if not most of the reasons for campaign failure could be found at the strategic level and in the absence of rigorous strategy, and especially at the interface between the political decision makers and their principal military advisors, the chiefs of staff. Now, other authors have drawn attention to this, but what I wanted to know was why the chiefs of staff, officers at the pinnacle of their profession, had given such bad advice. I therefore spent some time digging down into the primary sources to see what advice they themselves had received from their advisors, notably the Joint Planning Staff. The results were and are revealing. Lastly, as I researched and reflected, I was struck by the resonance that Norway 1940, if I can use that shorthand term, has today with more recent campaigns. And those in Iraq and Afghanistan spring quickly to mind. And of course, I was writing at the same time as the Chilcot inquiry were taking evidence for their report. However, I've avoided drawing direct then and now parallels or adopting a lessons learned approach, not least because the circumstances were very, very different and because all campaigns are sui generis. But I've indirectly dropped a few clues along the way that may cause the reader from time to time to have a sense of déjà vu. In summary, and to cut a long story short, the British campaign in Norway in 1940 is, in my view, a textbook example of how not to plan and conduct a campaign. And I think that conducting an autopsy and examining the anatomy of what Churchill termed this ramshackle campaign does help our understanding not only of it, but of campaigns more generally, and of some of the pitfalls that await the unwary. Thank you very much.
John, thank you. We said please leave plenty of time for questions, and you have. That's wonderful. We've got about 30 minutes, and it's much more useful to get you to respond to questions, I think. We can all read the book, which incidentally is available outside, and there will be signed copies, I suspect, if you hang around. So, who would like to begin? Would it be helpful to identify yourself? Go on then.
Oh my God.
It's okay, I might go homework. John, thank you much, first of all, for the very kind comments you made earlier. But my question is not about the present day, but it might be a reflection in one way for you. Back in 2013, a very good civil servant, James Duval, wrote an interesting study about whether we had very, very talented people in the United Kingdom, but we had sort of an institutional problem. We seem to be able to absorb good talent, put them in institutions that don't work very well, and then the decisions we get out of that process are awful. Was this an institutional failure problem rather than an individual one?
Very good, Rob. And yes, I have read Duval's report in detail. A lot of the factors that I consider contributed in a major way to the campaign being abject failure, there is a connecting theme to many of them, and it is culture. The culture at the time, the military culture at the time, the political culture at the time. It's a recurring theme throughout the book, and that's what Duval is talking about today. But also, going more into the detail of your question, that a lot of the decision-making structures as organizations were flawed. And this was surprising in a way because the decision-making structures at the time had been designed by Lord Hankey, Secretary of the Cabinet, and as A.J.P. Taylor said, gradually became Secretary of anything that mattered. And he had been brought back from retirement to become Minister without portfolio, he had designed in a war book what these structures would be, but they were deeply flawed. They couldn't cope with A, the complexity, and B, the speed of decision making. And Hankey would say they were also being used for a purpose that he hadn't designed them. And it struck me that if your structures are wrong, if your organizations are wrong, you're starting 15 love down. But then you have to add into that all these organizations are also organisms. They're living things where personal chemistry suddenly rears its ugly head. And it did hugely in this campaign, as those of you who've read the book will know. And that is a recurring theme to this day. The fact that the cabinet in 1940 was deeply divided was not new then, and it isn't now.
Okay, thank you. Sir? Hold on, there's a microphone on the way, would help.
Thank you. I've got to admit...
Can you identify yourself, please?
Sorry?
Can you identify yourself?
Oh, sorry. Howard Rose, member of the Institute.
Thank you.
I haven't read your book yet, so possibly what I'm going to ask you it may not be applicable. But there's a couple of things that strike me. I'm not a military man. This is purely my hobby. And as I drift into my dotage, I'm getting more and more interested in it. And something that's come over me through reading both wars, this ability of the ordinary German soldier to be much more, I've lost the word I wanted now, not aggressive, but independent at the lowest levels. Against the British soldier, you know, when I read about the campaign in Northwest Europe, there's not much about really the British Army, you know, being aggressive, jumping in, that sort of thing. Do you think that goes back to the whole of when the Third Reich was formed and the emphasis they put on their own people? Because it strikes me as if they treated their people as the greatest asset they had, and this country didn't. We still had that barrier. And the second thing, I don't know if this will be applicable at all, is about the Royal Navy. Because it strikes me in the campaign...
We'll get to that.
We get the very best and the very worst. We get Warburton Lee in Narvik. We get that, and then we get the misadventure of the Glorious being sunk by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau because Doyle Hughes hasn't put up any aircraft to scout, which is a basic tenet of what you do.
Okay, we got the drift of that. I suspect you'll be getting an answer on that one, actually. Lord West is up next.
Let's go to your first question. It's a really good question, and I spend most of one chapter going into why it was that in central Norway it happened. The British military, that's to say the army, performed less well than we would have liked. And I look at it in terms of fighting power and comparative fighting power, combat capability. And again, to cut a long story short, I see a great deal in the comparison between amateurism and professionalism, that the German military weren't absolutely brilliant, get everything right. This is the German army in Norway, but they got sufficient amount of this right to inflict a series of catastrophic defeats on the British soldiers. And the British soldiers were a territorial army. They had been trained in a pre-war, what I would call, cult of amateurism. And again, this amateurism you can see reflected at higher levels, at the operational and strategic levels. And it makes a very sad story when you see how those British soldiers should have been led and disciplined and trained and equipped and weren't. And of course the fault for that lies at higher levels. Whereas in the case of the German soldiers, many of whom had only been raised as reservists a few months before, they had been trained very thoroughly and equipped and led very thoroughly, and in a way, as you alluded to one in which initiative was encouraged rather more than it was in the British system. To go back to the Royal Navy, when I say that little is known about the campaign, one of the few services, of course, that do study the Norway campaign is the Royal Navy, not least because the Royal Navy won 3 Victoria Crosses, most notably at Narvik, 3 Victoria Crosses in that campaign, and the deeds of heroism and outstanding courage are exemplary. If there's a criticism of the book, it's that I don't focus, arguably, sufficiently on that. And I would argue back that I'm conducting an autopsy. So I'm looking at the parts of the body and the anatomy that didn't work well. And if I had been allowed by Cambridge University Press to write a longer book, that's one of the things I would have focused a bit more on, because it's a wonderful story. But it is a story that all the other histories have focused very highly on, because it's something to be proud of. There's one other thing that, to lead on from that, previous books on this subject have pulled their punches on the conduct of British soldiers in Norway. Largely, I think, because when they were writing, veterans were alive at the time. Now, the youngest veteran, who the youngest age fought in Norway, will now be over 96, 97. And I haven't felt constrained, maybe I should have been more, by what veterans think about what I've written. Other historians were more sensitive to that, and as a result pulled their punches, and I don't think did history a service by doing so. Just as a corollary to that, I discovered in my research that my own regiment, the Scots Guards, who were in northern Norway, had a company that ran away. Now, that doesn't feature, as you can imagine, too many regimental histories of the Scots Guards, but it was perfectly clear from a Norwegian and Danish observer that they had vacated their position without orders. They'd run away. And when I read this, I very nearly stopped writing the book. I thought, this is just too awful. I don't want to be the person that, highlights a company of my own regiment running away. And then I thought about it, and I thought, no, my job as a historian to say what happened, exactly what happened, the unvarnished truth, but to bring my experience, or whatever it is, to explain why it happened. And that's what I do in this and other instances. But every single battalion, British battalion that fought in Norway, had at least a platoon that, not to pull any punches, ran away, that left their position without orders. And all of this has been largely covered up in previous history.
Goes back to what we said at the beginning. Good history. Right, Admiral Lord West. So.
John, I'm afraid I haven't read your book yet. I'm sorry to say. My question, surprisingly, does relate slightly to the Navy. In your book, do you tackle at all the intelligence issue, the problem? Because we had the world's biggest Navy. It was a maritime invasion of Norway. If the intelligence had been assessed in the correct way, in the timely way, we could actually have destroyed the bulk of it before it got there. Do you address that? Do you address that issue and what the full impact was? Because it related then beyond that to when we were thinking of defending Britain, and the number of changes were made. And I wonder if you did that. As far as the Glorious goes, it was an absolute disgrace. He was rushing back to get a man court-martialed, and he had no aircraft airborne at all. One of the ships protecting was Ardent, which is the same name as my ship, which was sunk with one survivor who was there at the launch of my ship later. And I laid a wreath over that spot. But it was a disgrace, that whole incident, a very sad incident. But it's this intelligence issue.
Yeah. You'll be delighted to hear that I spend a whole chapter analysing this, because the intelligence blunder was absolutely critical to the whole outcome of the campaign. Once the blunder had been made, and it was not due to a lack of indicators. One author enumerates 61 different indicators, clear indicators that the Germans were about to invade Norway. all of them had been ignored, again, largely for cultural reasons. Intelligence at the time, the JIC had only just been formed. It was a pale shadow of its now current form. Intelligence was considered to be a third-rate trade. You don't put anybody who's worth anything into intelligence. As a result, senior commanders didn't pay much attention to what their intelligence staff said, and due to their own arrogance and hubris, they considered they knew best. And it wasn't just the military commanders. General Ironside, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, particularly vulnerable to that accusation. It was also politicians like Churchill. And again, there was a cultural reason that goes beyond intelligence technique, which is that from the very start of the war, the Admiralty could not believe that Germany could possibly be so foolish as to try and take on the Royal Navy in the open sea. And once this had been accepted by the chiefs of staff and by the cabinet, it was never ever questioned, even as more intelligence came that, well, they may not be quite as bad as we thought, and they may want to take a little bit of risk here. Nobody challenged that. And at the time, as you obviously know, what the Royal Navy really wanted was a reenactment of the Battle of Jutland with the score at 10-0, and that's what they really hoped was happening when they saw indicators of the German fleet setting to sea. They thought the Germans were trying to break out into the Atlantic. So when the British fleet set sail from Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, they headed north to try and cut them off, not west and southwest, which, as you indicate, if they had done that, the whole thing would have been over in 24 hours and the German fleet would have been destroyed for the rest of the war.
Thank you. Okay, Jonathan Isle and then Jonathan Isle and then Admiral McNally. Sorry, Jonathan.
Jonathan Isle from the Institute. I want to bring you back to the Hankey story at the beginning because from my research, I encountered him immediately at the peace conference, at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, when of course he was brilliant as a cabinet secretary. He was excellent in managing big egos like Lloyd George. He was excellent in working the machinery of government. And he presumably, I don't know, but presumably he was brought back from retirement precisely because of his fame in managing government departments and interdepartmental rivalries. And yet, I mean, what you seem to suggest is that was he just old and therefore the transmission mechanism didn't work? Or was the machinery of government so very different in 1939-40 than in 1919-20, when I repeat, from the perspective of almost everyone at Versailles, at the Paris Peace Conference, he was the man in every shape or form. And the 1920s, indeed. So the machinery of government, he invented the sort of joined-up government, if we can use today's terms.
He did, but Hankey was by nature a civil servant. He was not a politician. He was suddenly brought out of retirement to be a cabinet minister. From my reading of the primary sources, Hankey was one of those ministers that sat below the salt. And he wasn't, by nature, somebody to start rapping the table and saying, no, I wish to make a point. He was very easily fobbed off by Chamberlain. When Hankey makes a point, very often Chamberlain doesn't respond to it, just passes on to the next person asking a question. And Hankey is not an emotional person, and cabinets start getting very emotional, not least with Churchill in the War Cabinet. And Chamberlain tends to respect, Churchill because he has to, but also tries to bring into the conversations his associates, his fellow appeasers. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, Sir John Simon, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Samuel Hoare, Lord Privy Seal, people who've been fellow appeasers of him, like-minded people. And he's clearly brought Hankey in because he thinks Hankey has something to offer, and Hankey does. But very often when Hankey makes a really good point, and you really wish people had said, good God, we haven't thought about that, discussion moves on. And that happens with others as well. in the cabinet, those who perhaps sit below the salt, the other ministers for the armed services, Kingsley Wood, Leslie Horbelisha, and you have this feeling of, why aren't they listening to this guy? Because he's really talking sense.
Admiral McNally.
I'm John McNally, a member of the Institute. John, like others, I look forward very much to buying and reading your book, and even more to your forthcoming visit to the Naval and Military Club, where I guarantee you will sell lots of copies.
Thank you.
My question is that notwithstanding the failure to interdict and destroy the German invasion fleet, could after that, I know historians don't like what-ifs, but could the campaign have been won? Could it have been successful?
I conclude,
given the resources and the context of 1940.
I conclude in the book that there are two factors that would have to have changed for there to have been a good chance of it succeeding. One was the intelligence blunders. The other was the fact that air power, the power of air power, had come to the British Chiefs of Staff and ministers as what we would now call a revolution in military affairs. They were completely taken by surprise about what air power could do both on land and at sea, which of course the Germans weren't. And I devote a chapter also to why this is the case. If this was so critical to the campaign, why was it that the German political and military had managed to learn these lessons and the British hadn't? How could this be? And a lot of that goes back to military culture, that the inter-service rivalry was so great at that time that, following the Trenchard Doctrine, the Royal Air Force believed that if it became common knowledge as to the power, that air power could be applied and succeed both on land and at sea, and that's how the Germans intended to use their air power, in support of land operations, in support of sea operations, that the Royal Air Force would face an existential threat. Bear in mind the Royal Navy has just at this time got back control, after a bitter struggle with the Royal Air Force, of the Fleet Air Arm, and the Army is doing, at the Chiefs of Staff level, everything in its power to undermine the Royal Air Force and to have an Army air arm as well. And of course the Royal Air Force realised that if that happens, there isn't a job for the Royal Air Force. So they are suppressing any indicator that the German Army intend to use air power like that, and that this would be quite a sensible way of using it. Everything is on the strategic bombing offensive, to the extent that lecturers going to, for example, the Imperial Defence College are told not to mention the fact that the Germans have learnt all these lessons from the Spanish Civil War, and this is how they intend to imply it, because they believe it has real effect. And this is, a degree of inter-service rivalry that, in retrospect, is criminal. And yet at the time, that's how people were thinking, and the services were their own worst enemy and acting in the interest entirely of their service and not in the defence of the realm. Couldn't possibly happen today, of course.
Okay. So.
Frank Baldwin, a RUSI member. I have read your book, and I think I still owe you some money for it. At the risk of asking a two-part question here, one question I've got is you painted a picture of the strategy formulation as an emergent process, a collision of cultures and personalities. And my first part of my question is, to what extent was it inevitable that we would get dragged into Scandinavia, given the personalities and the cultures involved, and the result inevitable? In other words, was determined. And the second one is, in the long run, how much damage did that campaign do to Britain, or in the long run was it just an irrelevance?
That is a good two-part question. But I think, to start with, the focus on strategy is a really important one. Why was it that strategy as we understand it today, as I defined it just now, seems not to have taken place? Why was it that people weren't relentlessly focusing analytically on balancing the ends, ways and means. And if the political ends defined by policy could not be met by the ways and means available, why was somebody not pointing this out? And again, this goes back to, in my view, to culture. Partly it goes back to a fact that there was no common understanding of what the word strategy meant. Some would argue there still isn't today. And the way I defined strategy as a process of balancing ends, ways and means was certainly not the way that a lot of people at that time, including the Chiefs of Staff and including the Cabinet, defined it. They defined it as a link between policy and plans, where you got your policy and strategy turned them into plans. So it wasn't that as a process, and strategy was just a very large plan, and grand strategy an even larger plan. And this was a sort of doctrine. Actually, the word is inappropriate because I don't suppose there's any such thing as a doctrine, but an understanding that was very common at that time. And an over-interpretation of the principle of civil primacy by the Chiefs of Staff. They believed that their role was to proffer advice, and if that advice was rejected, to carry on and implement the policy. Not. And thus that strategy was a sequential, linear process. They didn't see that their role was that it was an iterative process, a discourse, an ongoing discourse, and that their role and duty was to go back and argue their case. And if their case had been misunderstood, to go back, and to go back to the politician and say, fine if that's what you want to do, but let us just point out the risks of that course. And the Chiefs of Staff did not do that. In recurring instances, they believed their role was to implement policy, and it was disastrous. In some cases, it was due to this misunderstanding of strategy. In some cases, it was not to put too fine a point on it, a lack of moral courage. And this is where, you know, the principles, the organisations, the organisms all start to play. And they were pretty well in thrall of Winston Churchill in Cabinet, and indeed in the Military Coordination Committee, which was between the Cabinet and the Chiefs of Staff. And because he was pretty forceful and emotional in what he was saying, they were very reluctant to go back and say, actually, I don't think that's going to work. And if you do that, the risk is huge. They were fearful of being seen as lily-livered, pusillanimous doom-mongers. There's an occasion when there's a cabinet meeting as to whether British forces go and help the Finns. This is actually just on practically the day that the Finns surrender. And there's a discussion about a wild goose expedition to go to Narvik and go across to Finland. And out of that meeting comes the chairman of the Chiefs of Staff, Air Marshal Sir Cyril Newall, and he says to somebody on the way out, I think the whole thing's harebrained. But in the meeting, there is no indication that he's not only not said those words, but hasn't said, look, I really think this is not very good. I don't think he's going to succeed. He has failed, and you know, it's difficult not to say there is a lack of moral courage there, to speak his mind in Cabinet. And one can only hope, you know, looking ahead, that people would see that that is not the way for a Chief of Staff to behave in Cabinet, despite all the pressures to do so. Sorry, the second part of your question
was, what did the Scandinavian expedition really make a big difference?
That's a good question. The whole purpose of the expedition was to deny the Germans the iron ore that came in winter by the railway over from Sweden to the Norwegian port of Narvik. And of course, by the invasion of France, the Germans have access to the Lorraine ore fields, high quality ore, vast quantities of it. The Germans have an advantage that they can interdict Arctic convoys, the biggest material disadvantage is actually to the Germans, because although naval losses are broadly similar, it's a huge proportion of the Kriegsmarine that is destroyed or damaged. And there are various arguments as to how much that reflects on the failure to invade with Operation Sea Lion. I happen to think that probably the biggest, and of course, the Norwegian resistance then suddenly come to the fore, and by April 1945 there are 400,000 German troops having to garrison Norway. But I think the biggest effect I have seen from that campaign is that suddenly Hitler believes in his own invincibility and genius, because it's he that has argued, oh, these risks, we can take the risks, it's my campaign, and there are a lot of people around at the top of the German armed forces sucking their teeth, and Hitler saying, no, this is going to succeed. And despite all their protests and doubts, it succeeds brilliantly. And he has this sense of his own genius, and the OKW, the Joint Operational Staff, who've played a very big part, therefore justify the big part they play in later campaigns, which is greatly to the detriment of Germany and the rest of the war.
Thank you. I think we've got time for 3 more questions. We can fit them in reasonably briefly. John Wilson.
John Wilson. Unfortunately, General, I haven't yet read your book, but I've read a number of other books on the subject. As I understand it, General Auchinleck realised the danger of the German Air Force, and he requested that he had a substantial anti-aircraft element with his forces. Unfortunately, as I understand it, the guns were put in one ship and the ammunition in another, and the ammunition ship was sunk. So when the guns arrived, they got nothing to fire, and of course he was left without that facility. I understand also that he had scant confidence in his British forces and thought that the French were who were a part of his contingents, were considerably better. And finally, I understand that in fact, as a result of, I believe, the 2 battles of Narvik, the Germans suffered such losses to their destroyers that Raeder actually advised Hitler and his chiefs that without the complete air superiority, Operation Sea Lion would not be viable, and in fact that was quite a crucial fact in saving us. Would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, there are 3 things there. Firstly, slight 2 stories into one there. The sending the ammunition in one ship, the gunners in another, and the guns in another happened in central Norway, happened continuously throughout the campaign, but that's where it had greatest impact and resulted in the evacuation of central Norway. Auchinleck comes very late into this campaign. He comes into the campaign on the 11th of May, and the whole thing's over 3 weeks, fortnight later. Yes, he does argue very strongly that either we have a sufficient amount of air defence and other assets, or this is not going to work. And the cabinet basically say, well, do your best. He says, I can't be responsible for the consequences. Which incidentally Churchill remembers at the end of the campaign and says, pray let me have the dates on which General Auchinleck was involved in this campaign. He holds it against the Auk for the rest of the war. So the Auk does say what is needed, but the Chiefs of Staff say, well, and the Cabinet, do the best you can. Auchinleck is very critical, and quite rightly, of in the British forces in his report to the Cabinet in June of that year, and is much more complimentary about the French. And certainly the French forces who fought at Narvik acquitted themselves very well. They were chasseurs alpins, so mountain troops, operating in the mountains within the Arctic Circle, did pretty well. And there were 2 battalions of the Foreign Legion. So these were what you might call elite troops. The British troops in Norway, in central Norway, were almost all territorial army who hadn't been trained in collective training properly to company level, let alone any higher. They had completely stopped their training in the winter because of the amount of snow. Nobody'd said that's where you're going, and by the way, if it snows, get out there and train because that's what you'll want. They hadn't done that. In and around Narvik, the troops who were there were the 24th Guards Brigade, and I mentioned the Scots Guards were part of that, whose training before the war had been amateur. There are echoes of the Falklands here, but a week before they were told they were going, the Irish Guards and the Scots Guards were on duty at Buckingham Palace, just like the Falklands actually. But their unlike the Falklands, the training that they had been doing before the war was amateur. On exercise, the mess silver would come out and the training would stop at lunchtime. That sort of thing. And again, you read this and it makes you quite angry. And Auchinleck is drawing a comparison, I think quite rightly, between that sort of amateurism and a much more professional French force that happened to be at Narvik at the time, let alone the professionalism of the Germans they were facing, who were, again, Gebirgsjäger, the 2nd Mountain Division, elite, professional German soldiers in their element.
Thank you. Okay, we need to finish at 7, so let's take the last two questions together. So,
hello, James Orme-Smith. I'm representing the anonymous donor of the alcohol, so you can come make friends with me.
You're
later.
very welcome.
General, I'm a retired Irish Guards officer, so have some small knowledge of the pretty terrible time that battalion had on the Chobbery. One thing I would say on behalf of the modest sort of private soldier at the bottom, decisions made at the top end may be marginal, but when it reaches the bottom, it can be catastrophic as the mistakes compound as they fall down the chain. So I think as much as companies may have run away, and I don't know the circumstances, they were the same men that ended up winning the war when there was momentum on their side. My question relates to what you might have uncovered, bringing back Churchill to the sort of conversation about maybe his ulterior motive, and I have to be, I guess, slightly sensitive to the ambassador for Norway here, but the noble adventure of saving Norway from the Germans, was there an ulterior motive of maybe perhaps occupying Norway because it had some pretty useful assets for the UK? Was that maybe the real motive for saving Norway?
okay, and final question from Malcolm Chalmers, and then you can deal with both of them together, John.
Yep.
John, absolutely marvellous book, but perhaps I can take the privilege of the last question and not detracting from that excellent question we've just had, to broaden the lens a little bit, because you paint quite a depressing picture in a sense, and both at the grand strategic level and some of your recent latter remarks at an operational level in terms of our preparedness, and also at a cultural level. So have you got any reflections on perhaps some examples of other British campaigns in the period since Norway which have been more successful, which illustrate that we do learn, or is it the case that, because using culture as a variable in these discussions has a mixed blessing, because sometimes culture sounds as if it's very hard to change and we're doomed to repeat cycles. If it's a strategic failure, we should be able to learn, but if it's a cultural failure, it's much harder to learn. So it's just a temptation really to as a last question, whether you get any broader reflections on British campaign history.
Just to go back to the previous question, again, your question is in two parts. The Irish Guards in this campaign had a moment of complete glory. Their ship on which they were travelling down the Norwegian coast, the Chobbery, was bombed, and the bombs landed amidships where there was an orders group going on. The commanding officer and all the company commanders, amongst others, were killed. The ship was sinking. the battalion was paraded in 3 ranks on the deck, rather like the Birkenhead in 1878. Thank you. Paraded in 3 ranks while the ship went down. Luckily, in the case of the Irish Guards, they were taken off by a Royal Naval vessel. But this is quite rightly something that the Irish Guards remember as a great battle honour, which indeed it was. And yes, they were let down by the people higher up. Churchill and ulterior motives. Actually, the greatest asset that I think the Cabinet saw, material asset, in Norway, was the Norwegian merchant fleet, which Norway had already given to the British very early on in the war. And certainly part of the emotional response in Cabinet was wanting to repay that to support the Norwegians, and arguably, with the benefit of hindsight, as soon as they discovered that the intelligence blunders, and as soon as they discovered that German air power was supreme, logically you could argue, well, why did they then go and send a lot of troops over there? This was reinforcing failure. So there was a moral imperative at the time to support the Norwegians, not least because there was a lot of publicity in this country, and particularly in France, caused the fall of Daladier's government, that we had let the Finns down. The gallant Finns, and this had caused a great deal of criticism of Chamberlain with his own party, with the opposition, in public opinion and the media. And so there's certainly a sense that we're not going to do that again. So I don't think there was. Certainly Churchill would have wanted to occupy Narvik, if you put it in that way, but only to reinforce and support the Norwegian fight back. Actually, I don't think it would have worked because of German air power, but I don't think there's that ulterior motive that you might have been hinting at. Going to Malcolm's question, of course, you know, at the outbreak of any war, it's not a good time to be a commander in the British military. And yes, this was an object lesson in how not to do it, in the planning, in the pre-planning, in the investment that hadn't been made in the armed services. And often people say, well, why haven't you used the reason this campaign failed? Because of the lack of investment in armed forces before the war. And that is a very strong factor. But those strategists and policymakers at the top of government and the armed forces knew there had been that kind of investment. They knew of the unpreparedness. And the strategist has to cut his or her coat according to the cloth that's available, rather than the cloth they wished they had. So, yes, it was a factor, but I don't buy it that this was one of the major factors. But you can think, I think, of other campaigns where maybe we got it right a bit better, in Korea and the Falklands. But certainly the cultural piece that you allude to is, it's very easy to forget how quickly wars can come upon you and how difficult it is to control war once there's a momentum going to it, which people would argue about today. And I think that's certainly true of the culture at the time, and that explains perhaps some of the amateurism that I was talking about earlier, which goes right up until the moment war begins, and even in the phony war after it. Something we might discuss downstairs.
John, thank you very much. The first Duke of Wellington would never talk about the Battle of Waterloo. He said you might just as well try to describe a ball, a society ball, as a battle. How would you describe a ball? Everything's going on at once. That's a battle. And there's a phrase often used by sports writers when dramatic things happen on the sports field. They say, now it is done, now the story ends, and there is no way to tell it. But the point is, historians have to tell it. They have to try to tell a story which has relevance to us, but is also accurate and unflinching and culturally sensitive. And I think, John, you've demonstrated in your book that you've certainly done that, and in your presentation tonight, you've certainly done that as well. And we're very grateful for that, and that you've made such a valuable and distinguished contribution to this first new iteration of the Duke of Wellington Medal for Military History. And so I offer the last word to His Grace, the Duke of Wellington. Sir.
Well, I would simply add that I think the last 45 minutes or an hour has demonstrated, first of all, what a wonderful and outstanding winner of this year's prize we have, and how interesting a discussion we've had after the award of the prize, very commensurate with the normal level of discussion in this distinguished research institute. So I think it's been a remarkably interesting evening, and I am very, very pleased that my ancestor's name is attached to the whole process.
Thank you.